Speaker. You know, we've all heard about a number of high-profile cases. One was Daisy Duke, a pet dog that was dragged behind a car in Didsbury, Alberta. Princess, that was a house cat that was microwaved, also in Alberta. Queen Waldorf from Niagara Falls, who was found abandoned on a beach with dumbbells attached to her neck, and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, the reality of animal abuse in this country is that every day, in every part of our country, animal abuse is occurring. And the people that are left watching their pets having been victimized or wild animals having been victimized are left to ask why we have no laws to go after these individuals, why the laws that we have are so weak. Those that are on the front lines of dealing with animal abuse, seeing day in, day out, tragedy after tragedy, and not being able to do anything. When I talk to SPCA officers who on a daily basis go out and receive these calls and say that they can't do anything, that their hands are tied, to see their frustration of having to witness that as people who love animals. But more, Mr. Speaker, than just people who love animals, how angry they get when those same homes that they visit, where individuals had tortured dogs, often is the precursor to violence against human beings. That those same houses where they see violence against animals are the houses later on where they see domestic abuse against a spouse or against children. That often this is a precursor of other types of crime. And they and Canadians are left to wonder why this type of crime is something Parliament simply hasn't done anything about. In fact, it was mentioned by the previous speaker that the laws that we have in place today have essentially been unamended since 1892. Now, that's not to say that in the last number of years Parliament hasn't tried. It has. If you look at the bills that have been put before this House over the last number of years, you have Bill C-17, C-15, C-15B, C-10, C-10B, and as recently as the last Parliament, C-50. In this Parliament, we also have my private member's bill, 373, and the bill that's in front of us today that we're debating, S-203. Now, the reality is, and I had a great deal of opportunity to work on C-50 in the previous Parliament, and to work to bring all stakeholders together to find common ground, to ask that all sides make compromise and work on something that would work not just for those that were proponents of protecting animals, but for those who legitimately used animals for their businesses or for their livelihood. And in doing so, we found near unanimity. We found that almost all groups reached a point of compromise on C-50, and in fact, this bill or a similar bill was able to pass through the House of Commons 2 times. So it was indeed the will of this House that strong, effective animal cruelty legislation be adopted and move forward. It was the will of this elected body that we have animal cruelty legislation that reflects the desire of Canadians. Yet, both times, it was the Senate that stood in our way. The Senate that said, no, we disagree, we want to make amendments. We almost got there in the last Parliament. Unfortunately, an election got in our way. And one would have thought, after all of that work, after all of that compromise, that upon our return to Parliament, we would have immediately embraced that compromise and introduced legislation immediately that addressed animal cruelty. Well, the reality is that didn't happen. It was left to private members' bills to try to address this gaping hole in our criminal code. One introduced by myself and one introduced by Senator Bryden in the form of the bill that's before us today that's seeking to be amended, S-203. Now, one could say, well, why don't we just adopt 203 as a first step? Just take it, adopt this, and we'll get to the rest. We'll get to all of those things that Parliament had already agreed on at some later date. Well, I'll give you a few reasons why 203 shouldn't be adopted. And I'm going to start with the fact that only 1/4% of animal abuse complaints result in a conviction. Now, essentially what this bill does is only go after sentencing. So one can imagine if you're only addressing sentencing, when you get convictions on only 1/4% of the problem, you're only dealing with 1/4% of the problem, effectively doing almost nothing to address the issue. The second point that I will make, and it just lists a number of things that 203 doesn't do that I think people would be surprised to learn. One, it does not make it easier to convict the perpetrators of crimes towards animals. It does not make it easier to punish people for crimes of neglect towards animals for whom they are responsible. It does not offer greater protection to wild or stray animals, which often have no protection at all. It does not clarify the confusing language in existing legislation that deals with types of animals differently, and it fails to make it a crime to train animals to fight one another. So these terrible crimes we see where they're pitting animals against animals and ripping each other apart, it would do nothing to deal with that. The second point is this. When does this House, as an elected body, accept from the Senate a lower standard? For this House to pass legislation twice and then to be told by the Senate, no, that's too far, that's too much, that's too effective, that's too far, too fast, and to turn it down. Why? When the Conservatives introduced a bill to get tough on crime, in their words, and introduced a crime bill, and they sent it to the Senate, they said that they would not accept any amendments by the Senate. They told the Senate they gave them a limited amount of time, and if they did not address it, that we would have an election. Why? Because crime was important. We needed to address it. They said to the Senate that they needed to listen to the elected will of this House. And yet, when it comes to animal cruelty, there is a double standard. They're willing to say, well, yes, the House has spoken. Yes, the House worked on years of compromise to create effective legislation. But on this bill, crime isn't as important. It's not a priority. Even though, as I mentioned before, it doesn't just impact animals, it's often a precursor to violence against human beings. I would also say that this notion that, and Senator Bryden addressed it when he talked before about those who want effective animal cruelty legislation losing the lever they have if this bill gets passed. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, he's quite right. And it's one of the things that those of us who are concerned about our ineffective animal cruelty laws worry most about. That this bill that is essentially a placebo, that does nothing to address the real issue of animal cruelty in our country, will be held out as action when none has been taken. Will be held out as a faint offer of having done something, so that we can say to our constituents, we acted on animal cruelty, when in fact we did nothing more than pass an empty, vacuous bill. That we will lose that lever to finally change and amend our laws. We've already waited 116 years. We embraced years of compromise. As a House, we adopted effective legislation. We're now going to let the Senate tell us to throw all of that away and to entrench essentially Victorian laws with antiquated notions about what animals are about. The last point on why 203 should be opposed, can you imagine trying to pass a bill that purports to do something about animal cruelty when every single animal welfare group in this country is opposed to it? And I'm not talking in this regard about animal activists, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about those that are on the front lines of dealing with abuse and torture in this country of animals. I'm talking about SPCA officers. I'm talking about the Humane Society. I'm talking about veterinarians who have to see tortured animals come into their offices and see nothing being done about it. These are the people crying for action, and they're not alone. In fact, Canadians overwhelmingly support effective animal cruelty law. A recent NANO research poll found that 85% of respondents supported legislation that will make it easier for law enforcement agencies to prosecute perpetrators who commit crimes against animals, including wild and stray animals. In fact, I have a petition of over 130,000 Canadians which has been presented before this House in opposition of this Senate bill and calling on support for my bill, 373. And I will say this, Mr. Speaker, I do not care if it gets passed as my bill. I don't care if it gets passed as a government bill. I will gladly give up my bill to anyone in this House who can get it passed and get it passed immediately. I will make the offer to the government today that I will put down my bill and offer it to them as their own so we can move forward with effective legislation. At the end, I just want to talk very quickly about what effective legislation can do, 203, and that's 373. It will allow for the prosecution of negligent animal owners. It will protect the rights of those who work and must kill animals for their livelihood, so it will protect those in agriculture and animal use industries. It will offer equal protection to pets and farm animals as well as wild and stray animals. It will make it illegal to train animals to fight one another. It will make it a crime to kill an animal with brutal or vicious intent. Mr. Speaker, we need effective animal cruelty legislation. The option exists for us to take action today. Let's reject this watered-down, vacuous placebo bill and finally do something about animal cruelty. Thank you.